Hey guys, tonight we step back into the scorching streets and glittering palaces of ancient Egypt, where the Nile shimmered like liquid gold under a merciless sun, and courts whispered betrayals that could end a life before breakfast. Imagine narrow corridors, hidden plots, and rulers whose every word could ignite wars. Most people wouldn't survive this world without losing their sanity or their head. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and your local time so we can see how far Cleopatra's story travels across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Cleopatra 7. Cleopatra had been done dirty by history long before Instagram faces and movie casting debates decided she was either a goddess or a fraud, with zero in between. The ancient world had reduced her to hot and dangerous, which was basically the Roman way of saying we lost and were mad about it. Rome did not like being outplayed, especially not by a foreign queen with opinions, so they spun the narrative like professional haters. Cleopatra's beauty became the headline because brains, strategy, and multilingual diplomacy did not sound as scary as seductive sorceress ruining good Roman men, which was honestly a skill issue on Rome's part. The funny thing was that even ancient sources admitted she was not some flawless supermodel. They said her real weapon was conversation, which meant she talked her way into power while everyone else was still flexing swords. That alone should have told people she was dangerous in the smartest way. Coins from her reign showed a sharp nose, strong jaw, and zero interest in looking cute for approval, which screamed, "I'm here to rule, not to be liked." Cleopatra knew optics mattered, but she never confused aesthetics with authority, and that balance kept her alive longer than most rulers with better PR teams. She ruled Egypt at a time when the kingdom was broke, politically unstable, and being side-eyed by Rome like a snack, so surviving required more than pretty privilege. She inherited a throne full of family members who treated betrayal like a sport, and somehow history still tried to make her story about romance instead of survival. Cleopatra understood early that power respected confidence, spectacle, and timing, so she used all three like tools, not personality traits. Roman writers later acted like her influence was supernatural, because admitting she was smarter felt embarrassing, and misogyny loves a mystical excuse. The myth of Cleopatra as just a pretty face stuck because it was easy, digestible, and low effort, kind of like a bad hot take that refuses to die. But the real Cleopatra was already negotiating grain supply, managing debt, and keeping Egypt relevant in a world dominated by loud Roman men who thought subtlety was weakness. This was not a love story yet. It was a survival arc. The bedtime version skipped the stress, but the real woman lived with constant pressure, political paranoia, and the awareness that one wrong move meant exile or death. Starting here mattered, because once the beauty myth cracked, everything else about her life made way more sense, and honestly, made Rome look even pettier in hindsight. Cleopatra had been Egyptian by crown, but Greek by blood, which confused people then and absolutely short-circuited modern debates. Even though ancient politics did not care about purity the way comment sections did. She belonged to the Ptolemaic dynasty, a Macedonian Greek family that slid into Egypt after Alexander the Great died, and everyone started fighting like kids over inheritance. These rulers had treated Egypt like prime real estate while refusing to fully integrate, marrying siblings to keep power in-house, and learning Egyptian culture only when it was convenient, which was often never. Cleopatra broke that lazy tradition hard. She was the first Ptolemy in generations who actually learned the Egyptian language instead of relying on translators and vibes. That alone was a political power move, because speaking to people directly hit different than issuing orders through intermediaries who might be lying. She leaned into Egyptian religion, iconography, and symbolism with intention, presenting herself as the living embodiment of Isis, which was less cosplay and more strategic branding. Egyptians understood gods, and Cleopatra understood Egyptians, so she met them where belief already lived. Meanwhile, Greek remained her administrative and intellectual base, because running an empire required spreadsheets, not just ceremonies. She balanced both identities like a professional multitasker, switching cultural codes depending on the room, which modern leaders still struggle with, by the way. Romans later acted shocked by this dual identity, as if multicultural competence was suspicious instead of effective. Cleopatra did not pick one side because power came from mastering both. Her court blended Greek philosophy with Egyptian ritual, and that fusion made her rule feel legitimate to locals and impressive to outsiders. Coins, statues, and temples showed her wearing Egyptian crowns while keeping Hellenistic facial features, which sent a clear message. She belonged everywhere she stood. Rome hated this flexibility because it made her harder to dismiss as other. She was not a foreign curiosity. She was fluent in the system. Critics later pretended she was playing dress-up, but rulers had always used symbolism to stabilize power, and Cleopatra just did it better. She knew Egyptians respected tradition and gods, so she honored both publicly while privately running the state with Greek efficiency. This was not confusion, it was calculated duality. Her identity had been a political asset, not an existential crisis. While Rome was busy pretending it owned the Mediterranean, Cleopatra was building legitimacy from the ground up, earning loyalty instead of demanding it. That loyalty mattered later, when things got messy and Rome came knocking louder than before. Cleopatra's Egypt was not some exotic backdrop. It was a functioning kingdom held together by deliberate choices, cultural intelligence, and a ruler who refused to be boxed into one label. The truth was simple but inconvenient. Cleopatra was Egyptian enough to rule and Greek enough to govern, and anyone uncomfortable with that mix usually had a control problem, not a historical one. Cleopatra had not been raised for softness, romance, or vibes. She had been raised for power, and the training started early, whether she liked it or not. The Ptolemaic court was less fairy tale, palace, and more reality show, with poison, alliances, and constant paranoia, so childhood innocence did not last long. Tutors drilled her in rhetoric, philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and politics, because ruling required competence, not luck. She learned how to argue, persuade, and listen strategically, which meant conversations were never casual, only calibrated. Languages became her flex. She reportedly spoke Greek, Egyptian, Latin, and several regional tongues, making her the original multilingual menace in a world where most rulers barely managed one. This skill let her bypass advisors, hear complaints directly, and catch lies in real time, which was elite-level governance behavior. While other royals leaned on lineage alone, Cleopatra stacked skills like she knew the job market was brutal. She also absorbed the harsh lesson that family meant nothing when power was on the table. The Ptolemies had a habit of eliminating siblings to secure the throne, so trust issues were basically inherited traits. Cleopatra watched relatives get exiled, murdered, or erased from records, learning early that survival meant staying alert and emotionally armored. She studied Egyptian religion not out of curiosity, but necessity, understanding that divine legitimacy kept rulers safer than armies alone. Education was her shield, because intellect traveled quietly while weapons drew attention. When she became co-ruler with her younger brother Ptolemy the Thegned, she already knew the arrangement was temporary at best and dangerous at worst. The court underestimated her because she was young and female, which she filed away for later use. Cleopatra did not waste energy fighting disrespect directly. She observed patterns, learned weaknesses, and waited. This patience read as passivity to people who thought power had to be loud, but it was actually strategic restraint. She knew timing mattered more than force. Her upbringing had prepared her for isolation, pressure, and decision-making under threat, which explained why she stayed composed when chaos eventually exploded. Cleopatra was not improvising later moves. She was executing lessons drilled into her since childhood. Every calculated pause, every bold entrance, every alliance traced back to years of preparation that history preferred to ignore. It was easier to romanticize her adulthood than admit she had been trained like a ruler from the jump. The messy truth was that Cleopatra grew up inside a system that rewarded intelligence and punished hesitation, and she adapted fast. By the time Rome entered her story, she was not some naive queen falling into drama. She was a seasoned political operator waiting for the right moment to act, fully aware that in her world, losing once usually meant losing forever. Cleopatra's biggest early ops had not been Rome or fate or destiny. They had been her own siblings, because the Ptolemaic family tree doubled as a crime scene. When her father died, the throne delivered her a co-rulership with her younger brother Ptolemy the Tenth, which sounded cooperative on paper but was actually a countdown to chaos. He was a kid, she was capable, and the court absolutely hated that combo. His advisors, grown men with fragile egos and too much influence, decided Cleopatra needed to be sidelined before she fully cooked. They pushed propaganda, froze her out of official documents, and tried to erase her authority like a bad browser history. Cleopatra saw the shift instantly and understood this was not sibling rivalry energy. This was political assassination in slow motion. The court accused her of arrogance, foreign sympathies, and basically being too competent, which was the ancient equivalent of calling someone difficult. Eventually, they forced her into exile, proving once again that family loyalty disappeared, the second power got real. Cleopatra did not spiral. She regrouped. Exile was not a defeat, just an inconvenient plot twist. She raised a private army in Syria because when diplomacy failed, logistics stepped in. Meanwhile, Egypt descended into chaos under Ptolemy the Thean's management, which shocked absolutely no one except his advisors, who still thought vibes could replace leadership. Civil war brewed, Rome watched closely, and Egypt's stability dropped faster than public trust. Cleopatra prepared to return, fully aware that reclaiming power required both force and finesse. This was not a girl boss montage. It was calculated risk under real danger. Her younger sister Arsinoe later joined the chaos, siding against her, and briefly becoming a rival queen, proving that sibling solidarity was a myth in this dynasty. Cleopatra understood that survival required decisiveness, and mercy rarely paid dividends in royal politics. The conflict escalated until Rome physically intervened, because Egypt mattered too much economically to be allowed to implode quietly. By the time Julius Caesar arrived, the sibling war had already destabilized the kingdom, and Cleopatra knew this was her opening. The palace drama had reached its messiest point, and she needed a reset button that only Roman backing could provide. History later framed these events as background noise to romance, but this phase was pure political warfare, ruthless and cold. Cleopatra lost her throne temporarily, but she gained clarity, allies, and momentum. The sibling rivalry did not harden her heart. It sharpened her instincts. She learned that power was never shared willingly, and that hesitation invited erasure. This lesson followed her for the rest of her life, shaping every alliance and every calculated risk that came next. Because once your own family tried to delete you, trust became a luxury item. Cleopatra's return to Egypt did not come with trumpets or mercy. It came with audacity, improvisation, and one of the most unnecessarily dramatic entrances in history, which somehow still worked. Rome had entered Alexandria, chasing its own civil war mess, and Julius Caesar arrived expecting compliance, not complications. Cleopatra understood instantly that marching in with an army would end badly, so she chose stealth, symbolism, and shock value instead. She had herself smuggled into the palace wrapped in a rug or linen sack, depending on which ancient writer was feeling poetic that day, because subtlety was dead and she needed Caesar's full attention. The move was risky, theatrical, and absolutely intentional. When she appeared before Caesar, she did not beg, she explained. She framed her exile as injustice, her brother as incompetent, and Egypt as too important to be mismanaged, which conveniently aligned with Roman interests. Caesar listened because she spoke his language, politically and literally, and because she offered solutions, not drama. Cleopatra positioned herself as the stabilizing option, the ruler who could keep grain flowing to Rome and chaos to a minimum. That mattered more than charm, no matter how many later historians pretended otherwise. Caesar backed her because she was useful, competent, and already halfway running the place. The resulting Alexandrian War was messy, violent, and not remotely romantic, despite later attempts to spice it up. Ptolemy XIII drowned during the conflict, Arsinoe was captured, and Cleopatra regained the throne with Roman support, now paired with another younger brother in name only. The city burned in parts, political rivals fell, and Cleopatra learned that Roman help came at a cost, but also came with teeth. Her alliance with Caesar was pragmatic, not dreamy. They needed each other, and both knew it. Cleopatra secured her rule, Caesar secured Egypt, and the world kept turning. The rug story survived because it was catchy, not because it defined her strategy. The real flex was how she walked into a losing position and walked out crowned again. She did not win by seduction. She won by relevance. Caesar respected competence, and Cleopatra delivered it under pressure. This moment marked her transformation from embattled queen to recognized power broker. Rome now had to take her seriously, whether it liked her or not. The entrance was iconic, but the aftermath was brutal and efficient. Cleopatra had gambled everything on one calculated meeting, and won, proving that sometimes the boldest move was also the smartest, especially when the alternative was being erased quietly by people who underestimated her. Cleopatra and Julius Caesar's relationship was less a rom-com and more a high-stakes business merger with benefits, except everyone pretended it was all sparks and love letters later. They shared a kid, Caesarion, which Rome quietly treated like an inconvenient footnote, because acknowledging a queen's child threatened the narrative that Rome owned the Mediterranean. Their situationship gave Cleopatra security, influence, and an upgrade from co-ruler to the de facto boss, while Caesar gained a client state, grain supply, and bragging rights that Rome pretended to not care about. Cleopatra had been careful to balance intimacy with authority. She never acted like a dependent because she knew Rome read weakness like headlines. Caesar reportedly admired her intellect and political acumen more than her looks, which honestly makes more sense than centuries of fan fiction. Their alliance stabilized Egypt, crushed rivals, and allowed Cleopatra to showcase her skills as ruler in a way that no one could ignore. She navigated Roman politics like a pro, attending banquets, giving speeches, and making sure her son's position was known without being obnoxious about it. Basically, CEO energy with baby flex. Caesar left her in charge while he returned to Rome, and Cleopatra's management style made it clear that she wasn't just a placeholder. She was the backbone of Egyptian stability. Romans spun propaganda painting her as manipulative seductress, of course, because history loves a villain when a woman has agency. Cleopatra didn't care. She knew perception was temporary, but power was permanent. Caesarion's birth complicated Roman narratives because he was both a legitimate heir and a political threat, something Caesar shrugged at, but enemies used as ammo for gossip and plotting. Cleopatra's diplomacy, charisma, and nerve had created a situation where Rome had to negotiate, not dictate. She was the only queen in generations who had turned a military protector into an ally who respected her agency, which is peak mic drop energy in any era. Everyone else in history either died, got exiled, or got eaten by politics, but Cleopatra played the long game. Her image in coins and temples showed her looking regal and composed, signaling continuity and authority, while Rome fretted in whispers about her influence. This period cemented her reputation as someone who could charm, strategize, and survive simultaneously, which meant any later scandal was really just political storytelling. Cleopatra did not just ride Caesar's coattails. She negotiated the length, color, and stitch of those coattails herself. By the time Caesar returned to Rome, She had secured her throne, her son's status, and Egypt's stability, proving that she could convert intimate alliances into real political power, a skill Rome respected but did not want to admit. The history books would later focus on the romance and side-eye Cleopatra for ambition, but the truth was far messier, smarter, and totally hers. Rome's reaction to Cleopatra had been pure side-eye energy from the jump, because the Republic did not handle women who outplayed men without apologizing, especially foreign queens who threatened their fragile egos. Senators whispered, poets scribbled, and gossip spread like wildfire, all framing Cleopatra as a manipulative temptress rather than a competent ruler, because admitting she was smart was too much cardio for their brains. Propaganda campaigns painted her as exotic, seductive, and dangerously ambitious, which conveniently erased the nuance of her political strategy and reduced her to a problem in heels in the Roman imagination. Every coin, every letter, and every speech had been twisted to support the narrative that Rome was the logical hero and Cleopatra was the petty villain, when in reality she had simply made Rome negotiate on her terms, which terrified them. Historians like Plutarch and Cassius Dio laced their accounts with misogynistic undertones, exaggerating romance and underreporting her administrative genius, because nothing sells better than scandal, especially if it involves a woman outsmarting men. Cleopatra's Egyptian identity complicated things even further, because Rome was obsessed with control and cultural supremacy. A queen speaking multiple languages, ruling effectively, and managing her economy was not just irritating, it was existentially threatening. Caesar's assassination left her politically exposed, but she played the post-Caesar landscape like a chess grandmaster, balancing alliances with Mark Antony while keeping the Egyptian economy and military tight. Roman elites continued to frame her as a disruptor, conveniently ignoring that Antony's decisions often mirrored hers, proving that male rulers could be ambitious without social media threads dragging them. Cleopatra lived rent-free in Roman minds because she could manipulate perception, policy, and diplomacy simultaneously, a triple threat Rome had no guidebook for. While Romans gossiped, she maintained infrastructure, grain supply, and the stability of the Nile, ensuring her people thrived even as foreign powers freaked out about her existence. Her image as a schemer stuck because it was easier than grappling with the uncomfortable fact that she outmaneuvered empires, which is peak insecurity energy on Rome's part. Cleopatra used Rome's fear strategically, showing her competence publicly while letting them obsess privately, which was honestly chef's kiss diplomacy. She had turned their anxiety into a tool. Every exaggerated story about her seduction was basically free PR, highlighting how dangerously effective she could be. Cleopatra's reputation may have been filtered through misogyny and fear, but she thrived on it, bending perception without losing grip on reality. Rome side-eyed, yes, but they could not ignore that she ran Egypt efficiently, managed her co-rulers, and negotiated with generals who fancied themselves unstoppable. Misogynistic history may have rewritten the narrative, but the receipts of her strategy, her linguistic prowess, and her political audacity were unerasable proof that Cleopatra had not just survived Roman obsession, she had weaponized it. Then came Mark Antony, and things got spicy, like full-on soap opera meets political boardroom energy. Cleopatra and Antony met in Tarsus, and the whole thing was less love at first sight, and more two power players sizing each other up while flexing assets. Antony had been busy dealing with Rome's mess, civil wars, and ambitions that would not quit, and Cleopatra walked in with confidence, strategy, and enough Nile energy to make anyone reconsider their life choices. Their alliance started practical. She needed Rome's protection. He needed grain, legitimacy, and a client queen who could stabilize the East, but it quickly escalated because both were brilliant, ambitious, and low-key addicted to drama. They traded power, flirtation, and political favors like it was a stock market, and Rome freaked out because two rulers openly ignoring boundaries was apparently scandalous. Cleopatra knew how to play Antony's ego without losing her throne, while Antony adored her not just for charm, but for brains, vision, and the sheer audacity to stand toe-to-toe with him. Their love, or partnership, depending on how cynical your take, produced 3 children, political leverage, and enough gossip material to fuel Roman senators' nightmares for decades. The pair threw lavish parties, coordinated armies, and even funded monuments because showing wealth and competence was another form of flexing dominance over adversaries. Their union was literally a power move disguised as romance. Every dinner, every alliance, every public display broadcasted, "We run this region together, Rome, you mad?" Antony was simultaneously committed and reckless, which Cleopatra exploited like a pro, knowing a little chaos kept rivals off balance. History painted this as scandal, exotic indulgence, or fatal lust, but the truth was messy, smart, and intentional. They coordinated campaigns like the ill-fated Parthian adventures, demonstrating that their bond had both emotional and logistical dimensions. Cleopatra's Egypt thrived under Antony's partial attention, proving that she could manage local governance and international politics simultaneously, a full-time CEO energy scenario just with more snakes and fewer HR complaints. The partnership drew enemies, whispers, and propaganda, but Cleopatra and Antony thrived in the tension, leveraging fear, loyalty, and spectacle to maintain influence. By mixing strategy with personal connection, Cleopatra turned what Rome called scandal into a functional power network, proving that when 2 ambitious leaders paired up, perception became another weapon. Their saga was messy, dramatic, and political as hell, which is exactly why historians later framed it as a tragic romance, instead of the strategic genius move it truly was. Cleopatra had not just seduced a Roman general, she had co-ruled, co-planned, and co-claimed a swath of power that threatened the balance Rome thought it controlled. And she did it all while wearing the crown, staying sharp, and occasionally throwing epic eye rolls at Antony's impulsiveness. Cleopatra ruled Egypt like a CEO with zero chill, running infrastructure, grain shipments, taxes, and diplomacy, while Rome obsessed over her love life, which was peak disrespect, but also hilarious if you liked chaos. She managed the Nile's flooding cycles, ensured harvests, stayed productive, and stabilized Egypt's economy so effectively that citizens had little reason to riot, even while foreign powers whispered about her like she was a villain in someone else's fanfic. Cleopatra funded temples, rebuilt cities, and organized trade routes that stretched across the Mediterranean, basically turning Egypt into a luxury brand everyone wanted a piece of. Her policies were calculated, and she knew propaganda mattered, so statues, coins, and monuments broadcasted power and divine legitimacy, flexing her competence like a permanent LinkedIn update. Meanwhile, she used diplomacy to keep allies close and enemies closer, including tricky Roman generals and regional kings who were perpetually trying to outmaneuver her. Cleopatra also minted coins with her face that looked assertive, not pretty, because she knew appearances were power, not decoration. Under her leadership, Egypt didn't just survive, it thrived, which is peak CEO energy considering the internal drama and external threats. She modernized tax systems, ensured grain exports were reliable, and even handled the bureaucratic headache of her co-rulers and children's positions without breaking a sweat, proving multitasking before it was cool. Cleopatra's rule combined spectacle with substance. Lavish displays kept morale and loyalty high, while administrative rigor kept the country stable. Her intelligence and vision made her more effective than most contemporaries who relied on intimidation or brute force instead of strategy. Cleopatra also knew when to pivot. She could deploy charm, threat, or diplomacy depending on the audience, which is basically 101 leadership lessons packaged in a crown. Rome kept trying to undermine her, sending spies and whisper campaigns, but Cleopatra's tight control over domestic affairs and her strategic alliances kept Egypt untouchable for decades. Even Antony and Caesar had to acknowledge her management skills because, unlike many rulers, She didn't just rely on inherited power, she improved it, leveraged it, and broadcasted it without apology. Cleopatra's reign was messy, brilliant, and relentless. She juggled personal alliances, foreign threats, and domestic stability like a professional circus act, with zero safety nets. History tends to reduce this period to love stories or exotic queen vibes, but the reality was much sharper, much riskier, and far more impressive. Cleopatra demonstrated that female rulers could wield intelligence, vision, and authority simultaneously, outmaneuvering allies and enemies alike, and doing it with a flair that made history obsessed with her charisma rather than her capability. She had turned governance into performance art, and survival into strategy, proving that running an empire was way more than a crown. It was skill, nerve, and constant calculation, plus a little drama for seasoning. The Battle of Actium hit like a cinematic meltdown, with Cleopatra and Antony's dreams crashing against Rome's ambition in full HD. They had amassed a fleet, fired up soldiers, and hoped strategy plus charisma would win. But Octavian had been plotting like a chess grandmaster on steroids, watching their every move while pretending to sip tea. Antony and Cleopatra's combined forces were impressive on paper, flashy in formation, and very look at us, Rome. But coordination was messy, morale was shaky, and trust was already wobbling because rumors and miscommunication traveled faster than the Nile currents. Cleopatra's ships had been slow, Antony's focus split, and both leaders underestimated Octavian's patience and cunning, which is basically a rookie mistake for generals, but somehow forgivable because everyone loves drama more than logistics. The battle itself turned chaotic. Fleets scattered, fires raged, and Antony panicked when Cleopatra's ships retreated. She strategically withdrew to protect her forces and treasure, but he read it as betrayal, which is classic tragic misunderstanding energy. Rome seized the moment, picking off stragglers, capturing supplies, and turning the tide with brutal efficiency. Antony attempted a last stand, but eventually retreated to Alexandria, devastated and humiliated, while Cleopatra's carefully curated image of invincibility faced the harshest test yet. Their empire had depended on mutual support, and when Actium collapsed, the fragile scaffolding of alliances and morale crumbled in real time. Cleopatra had to pivot immediately, thinking several moves ahead, while grief, fear, and exhaustion threatened to paralyze her decision-making. She focused on securing Egypt, protecting Caesarion, and preparing for the inevitable Roman advance, demonstrating that leadership in collapse looked very different from leadership in peak flex. Antony's pride and desperation collided with Cleopatra's pragmatism, resulting in tension, blame, and ultimately tragedy. Meanwhile, Octavian's propaganda machine was revving up, framing Cleopatra as the schemer who seduced Antony and caused Rome's suffering, ignoring the fact that Antony's ego and strategic errors had been equally responsible. Cleopatra had seen this coming and understood she could not outfight Rome alone, so she shifted to survival mode, balancing diplomacy, threat, and theater to keep her throne and her people intact. Actium marked the beginning of the end, not because Cleopatra lost talent or nerve, but because even geniuses hit limits when Rome played long-term strategy while personal drama interfered. Her decisions in the aftermath would define not only her legacy, but the final chapter of Ptolemaic Egypt, showing that even when an empire collapses around you, calculated action and foresight can turn a total disaster into a managed exit, or at least a memorable one. Cleopatra's death, like her life, became a mashup of mystery, propaganda, and theatrical storytelling, with Rome shaping the narrative to make her look like a tragic femme fatale rather than a ruler cornered by circumstances. Antony had already killed himself after hearing false rumors of Cleopatra's demise, leaving her with the impossible task of salvaging dignity, protecting her son Caesarion, and facing Octavian's inevitable conquest. She reportedly tried negotiations, sent messages, and staged appearances to Project Calm, but the walls of Alexandria were closing in, and reality did not care about optics. Ancient accounts suggest she allowed an ASP, likely an Egyptian cobra, to bite her, a method loaded with symbolism, fear factor, and a heavy dose of narrative flair that Rome later amplified to sell moral lessons about ambition and seduction. Whether she actually used a snake or a poison is debated, but the story stuck because it was dramatic, photogenic, and morally convenient for Rome. The foreign queen who dared defy them ended elegantly, but alone. Her death protected Caesarion temporarily, but Octavian quickly executed him, erasing the male heir from history like a glitch in Rome's spreadsheet of control. Cleopatra's final hours were a blend of theatricality, pragmatism, and survival instinct, because even in death, she controlled perception, showing the world that her exit would be hers to script, not theirs. Romans painted her as manipulative, lustful, or morally corrupt, ignoring her decades of governance, economic acumen, and diplomatic brilliance, because a villainous queen was easier to teach morality to the masses than a competent, fearless woman. Cleopatra had ruled with intelligence, charisma, and foresight, and her death became the stage upon which Rome could rewrite the story to fit patriarchal comfort. Coins, monuments, and letters vanished or were repurposed, but the essence of her power lingered, echoing in whispers of fear and admiration across the empire. Cleopatra's narrative had been filtered, sensationalized, and weaponized by enemies, yet the core truth remained. She had faced defeat on multiple fronts, made calculated choices, and retained agency until the end, which is more than most rulers in history can claim. The snake, or poison, or metaphorical version thereof, represented her refusal to be paraded, humiliated, or turned into a political puppet. Even in death, Cleopatra maintained a form of sovereignty, refusing to hand Rome the full satisfaction of total conquest over her identity and legacy. Ancient gossip, Roman propaganda, and later historical exaggeration framed the event as a cautionary tale, yet her life and exit demonstrate resilience, strategy, and control, reminding future generations that Cleopatra's power was never just in her charm or beauty. It was in her mind, her decisiveness, and her ability to survive narratives designed to erase her. She died on her own terms, leaving behind a kingdom that Rome would absorb, but also a story that could not be fully extinguished, and a lesson that history's villains are often simply those who refuse to be controlled. Cleopatra's legacy had been a mess of misogyny, myth, and straight-up historical roast, because for centuries, people preferred gossip to nuance and hate reading to actual research. Writers, artists, and politicians turned her into either a seductress or a cautionary tale, forgetting that she had ruled, reformed, and survived like an absolute unit for decades, a fact too inconvenient to fit neatly into patriarchal storytelling. Movies, plays, and coins obsessed over her looks or supposed scandal, ignoring that she had been fluent in multiple languages, commanded armies, managed grain economies, and outmaneuvered the world's loudest republic without flinching. Cleopatra had been the ultimate multitasker, diplomat, ruler, mother, strategist, and performer all rolled into one, juggling perception and reality while everyone around her tried to gaslight history. Her story was a masterclass in controlling narrative, because she understood optics, propaganda, and theater long before branding was a buzzword. Misogynistic historians tried to make her weakness her allure, but the receipts of her intelligence, resilience, and political savvy refused to be silenced, and centuries later she still became the subject of obsession because powerful women are literally unignorable. Cleopatra's name survived, memes or not, because she refused to be a footnote, turning even her supposed failures, like Actium or Antony's death, into enduring legends that highlight strategy, not just drama. She proved that historical judgment often says more about the judge than the judged. Rome needed a villain, and she fit the bill perfectly, so they made her one. Meanwhile, Cleopatra had already ensured her story would persist, cleverly weaving symbolism, loyalty, and political foresight into her life in ways that outlasted emperors and empires. She had set the standard for what it meant to run a kingdom like a CEO, with charisma and authority intertwined, while history continued to misread her as a romantic footnote. Cleopatra's legacy reminds modern readers that power, intelligence, and audacity can be coded as scandal in patriarchal narratives, and that surviving, thriving, and influencing a world designed to erase you is itself a heroic act. From coins to literature to the obsession of pop culture, Cleopatra had become the ultimate reference point for female agency, a queen whose story refuses to be simplified into romance or aesthetics alone. History may have tried to roast her, misquote her, and glamorize her failures, but Cleopatra had outlived narratives, empires, and stereotypes alike, leaving a record that blends legend with undeniable skill. Her life teaches that leadership, strategy, and sheer nerve can outlast even the harshest spin, that surviving in a world built to doubt you is a victory in itself, and that the stories people tell about you rarely capture the full genius of your moves. Cleopatra remains untamed in memory, an eternal reminder that women who dare to command are rarely understood immediately, and that brilliance wrapped in audacity will echo forever, messy, human, unapologetic, and unforgettable. In the quiet mists of early morning, long ships glided silently across the cold waters of the North Sea. Their slender hulls, dark as wet stone, cut through the fog with effortless precision, carrying men whose lives were carved by the harsh lands of Scandinavia. These were the Vikings, fierce, relentless, and yet guided by traditions older than the forests behind their villages. The year was 793, and the shores of England had yet to know the shadow of the Northmen's ambition. Villages lay scattered along the coastline, their thatched roofs warm from fires burning low, smoke rising lazily into the dawn. Monks moved between wooden halls and stone churches, their chants echoing softly, unaware that the world beyond their monastery walls was changing, moving closer with each wave. As the long ships drew near, the first signs of their presence were almost ghostly. Black sails, catching the morning light, swelled silently against the wind. The oars dipped in unison, rhythm steady and methodical, a heartbeat in the fog. The men aboard carried not just axes and swords, but a history of survival, raids, and the lure of wealth and land. England, with its monasteries and unprotected towns, called to them like a siren. When they reached the shore of Lindisfarne, the world still held its quiet charm. The small monastery stood on its island, monks tending to their daily prayers, unaware of the storm approaching from the sea. The Vikings stepped onto the sand, boots sinking slightly in the wet earth. Their movements were swift, practiced, and without hesitation. What happened in the following hours would echo across centuries. The serene chants were broken by the clash of iron and the sudden cries of terror. Precious manuscripts and treasures, symbols of faith and learning, were carried off into the longships. Fires licked the wooden walls as the monastery succumbed to the raiders' fury. England, once shielded by the sea and its quiet villages, had awakened to a new era, one of fear, resilience, and transformation. But the Vikings were not merely destroyers. Among their crews were storytellers, traders, and sailors who had crossed countless seas. Every raid, every conquest was part of a larger journey, a journey that would leave marks on the land and its people for generations. As the sun climbed higher, the longships returned to the sea, sails full, treasures in their hold, and the cries of the monastery fading into the wind. From that day on, the coastlines of England were never truly at peace. Villages would brace for the unknown, and kings would wonder at the might of strangers who came not only to plunder, but to stake claims on a land rich with opportunity. The Vikings, for all their ferocity, had become a shadow upon England's dawn, a shadow that would linger, shaping the lives of those who remained behind. And so, the story began, not with battles alone, but with journeys across the sea, men guided by ambition, skill, and the cold, unyielding waves. The raids would come again, each one leaving echoes in the hearts of both the raiders and the raided. The years following the first strike at Lindisfarne were marked by a quiet dread that settled over England like morning fog. Villages along the coast began to change their rhythms. Smoke from their hearths no longer rose lazily into the sky, but was hidden behind walls of timber, signaling caution rather than warmth. The people spoke in hushed tones about the Northmen, strangers who arrived without warning, carrying both death and gold. Yet the Vikings did not strike at random. They moved with purpose, guided by knowledge passed down through generations. They understood tides, winds, and the hidden channels of rivers, allowing them to reach towns that felt unreachable. Their longships, with their shallow hulls, could glide silently into creeks and estuaries, leaving behind only a faint ripple that vanished as quickly as it appeared. In one small fishing village, nestled on the banks of a quiet river, the inhabitants sensed the warning too late. On a morning veiled in mist, a shadow appeared on the horizon. The longships, sleek and black, drew closer, their sails tense with the northern wind. Families scrambled, clutching what little they could carry. There was no time to reason, no time to negotiate. The Vikings moved with the precision of hunters, axes flashing and shields raised, yet their presence was not chaotic. It was methodical. The village fell quickly, its treasures claimed, its homes set ablaze. But amid the destruction, some villagers escaped into the surrounding woods, their eyes wide with terror and awe. They would tell stories of the raiders, tall men with hair like woven fire and eyes sharp as the edge of a blade. The Vikings spoke little, their focus on the task at hand. They took what they wanted, left warnings in their wake, and disappeared as silently as they had arrived, leaving only smoke and whispers behind. Kingdoms took notice. News of these raids spread from one court to another, carried by travelers and merchants, leaving rulers anxious and restless. Fortifications were considered, armies raised, yet the Vikings seemed always one step ahead, striking where defenses were weakest. England was learning a painful truth. The sea, once a boundary that protected them, had become a path of peril. And still, the Vikings did not linger. They returned home, laden with spoils, stories of distant lands, and the quiet satisfaction of their mastery over sea and shore. For them, each raid was more than plunder. It was a demonstration of skill, courage, and the timeless bond between man and ship. They celebrated victories in the longhouses of Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, weaving tales of distant shores that would inspire younger warriors to seek their own fortunes across the waves. As the seasons turned, the people of England adapted. Watchtowers rose along rivers, bells were hung to signal approaching sails, and local leaders trained men in arms. Life continued, fragile and wary, against the relentless rhythm of the northern tide. The shadow of the Vikings lingered, not as a memory of a single attack, but as a warning of an age where the sea itself was alive with strangers, and the world beyond the horizon held both danger and destiny. And so, the coastlines of England braced for the future, unaware that the raids were only the beginning of a saga that would stretch for decades, shaping kingdoms, lives, and the very culture of the land itself. By the turn of the 9th century, the waves carried more than whispers of distant lands. They carried the rising storm of the Viking raids. The people of England, once confident in the safety of their villages and monasteries, now measured the seasons not by harvests or prayers alone, but by the shadow on the horizon. Every morning, fishermen and farmers would glance toward the sea, searching for the telltale line of black sails that promised upheaval. The Vikings had grown bolder. Their strikes were no longer limited to isolated monasteries or small coastal villages. They began to target towns, marketplaces, and centers of wealth, places where silver coins jingled and treasures accumulated over generations. These raids were swift, precise, and often devastating. Yet, beneath their ferocity, the Northmen moved with a rhythm almost ritualistic, as though the sea itself guided their actions. In the heart of Northumbria, the town of Jarrow prepared for the inevitable. Rumors had reached them, fishermen returning with stories of longships spotted miles away, men whose voices carried the chill of the north wind. The townspeople, though fearful, did what they could. Doors were barred, valuables hidden, and prayers whispered for protection. The monks in the abbey continued their chants, their voices trembling but unwavering, as if sound alone could ward off the approaching menace. When the Vikings arrived, the town experienced the full weight of their reputation. Axes shattered doors, and the clash of iron against timber echoed across the riverbanks. Yet the raiders, though fierce, were organized, moving with the efficiency of those who had practiced this dance of conquest for years. They did not linger unnecessarily. Their goal was to strike, seize, and vanish before the forces of defense could gather. Among the Vikings, stories were told in whispers during the journey to the shore. Tales of previous raids, of treasures carried home, and of villages that resisted, only to fall later. They spoke not only of plunder, but of the sea itself, of how tides, winds, and stars guided them to distant shores. To the Northmen, every raid was part of a larger journey, a journey that tested their courage, skill, and endurance, and rewarded them with both wealth and legend. The people of England, meanwhile, began to adapt in ways small but significant. Watchmen were stationed in higher towers, signaling bells rang at the first sight of sails, and fortified enclosures offered refuge for those who fled. Trade routes shifted, and communication between towns grew more urgent. Every family learned the patterns of the tides and the signs of approaching danger, carving survival into the rhythm of daily life. And yet, the raids continued, relentless as the waves themselves. England was being reshaped, village by village, river by river, by the shadow of these northern warriors. In each attack, there was loss, fear, and upheaval, but also stories, whispered tales of bravery and cunning of those who escaped and those who confronted the invaders with defiance. The stage was being set for a new era, one in which kingdoms would rise and fall, alliances would form and shatter, and the Viking presence would leave an indelible mark upon the land. The Northmen were no longer strangers from the sea. They were forces that would test the very fabric of England itself. As the Viking raids spread across England, the rulers of the land could no longer remain idle. Kingdoms that had once been divided by disputes over land and titles now faced a common threat. From the great halls of Wessex to the rivers of East Anglia, kings and earls gathered their warriors, seeking ways to defend their people from the relentless tide of raiders. King Ethelred of Northumbria, though wise and experienced, knew the challenge was unlike any he had faced before. The Vikings did not simply arrive to fight. They struck swiftly, disappeared just as quickly, and left devastation in their wake. Fortifying towns and training soldiers became urgent matters, yet the seas, wide and unyielding, remained largely beyond control. The longships, with their shallow hulls and sharp prows, allowed the Northmen to navigate rivers and estuaries that seemed safe to the English, catching even the most prepared communities off guard. In one coastal town, a young warrior named Edric watched the horizon with a mix of fear and determination. He had grown up hearing tales of the Northmen, stories of their skill in battle and cunning at sea. Now, as the black sails appeared on the morning tide, those tales became reality. The townspeople scattered to their refuges, while Edric and a few other men took up arms to defend their home. Though outnumbered and facing a fearsome enemy, they fought with a quiet bravery that would be remembered in whispered tales for generations. The Vikings themselves were not strangers to hardship. Many had grown up in harsh climates, their bodies shaped by the cold, their minds sharpened by the constant demands of survival. Every raid was both a test and a tradition, a way to honor their ancestors, earn wealth, and gain renown among their peers. The men who stormed the towns carried more than axes and shields. They carried the weight of their homeland, the call of the sea, and the unspoken bond between crew and ship. The clash between the Vikings and the English was more than mere combat. It was a meeting of worlds, the northern lands, shaped by ice and ocean, meeting the fertile fields and bustling towns of England. Each raid brought change, towns rebuilt stronger, rivers patrolled, alliances forged between neighboring communities. The English began to adapt not only their defenses, but their way of thinking, learning to anticipate the unpredictable strategies of the invaders. Despite the devastation, life continued. Farmers planted their crops, fishermen cast their nets, and children played along riverbanks, sometimes unaware of the dangers that lurked beyond the horizon. The Vikings, in turn, moved like shadows, striking and retreating, their stories traveling back to the north as tales of wealth, courage, and conquest. England was being transformed, not just through fire and blood, but through resilience and adaptation. And so, the land became a stage where kings and warriors faced an unending challenge, and the Northmen, guided by tides and instinct, tested the limits of courage, strategy, and survival. The raids were no longer simple acts of violence. They were shaping a history that would echo for centuries, defining the strength of a people and the cunning of a seafaring culture that seemed almost inseparable from the ocean itself. As the years passed, the Vikings' reach extended further south, toward the fertile lands of Wessex. The kingdom, known for its rolling hills and bustling towns, had grown prosperous, its wealth tempting the raiders who had learned to read the patterns of rivers, tides, and weather. Villagers now spoke in hushed tones of the longships that could appear like shadows at dawn, bringing both fear and the possibility of loss beyond imagining. King Ethelwulf of Wessex understood the gravity of the threat. He had seen villages burn, monasteries plundered, and families shattered. He knew that defending his kingdom required more than walls and soldiers. It demanded strategy, vigilance, and an understanding of the enemy who moved like the wind. Scouts were sent to monitor the coasts, warning bells were installed on cliffs, and fortified towns became the new heart of Wessex. On a misty morning along the coast, a small village prepared for the inevitable. Families hid valuables in hidden caches, doors were barricaded with timber, and watchmen scanned the waves for the first sign of sails. The villagers whispered prayers, hoping that the Northmen would pass them by, yet they knew too well that luck alone would not protect them. The Viking longships appeared as if from the mist itself, their black sails taut against the wind. The raiders' movements were swift, practiced, and precise. They disembarked with the silence of predators, axes, and swords at the ready, eyes sharp with anticipation. To the villagers, it seemed as though the sea had delivered both doom and destiny upon their doorstep. Among the defenders was Edric, now older, who had witnessed many raids and learned much from each encounter. He rallied the townspeople, guiding them toward safety, creating small defenses from carts, fences, and whatever wood they could gather. Though the raiders were relentless, Edric understood that courage and cleverness could make the difference between survival and destruction. The battle that followed was swift. The Vikings took what they wanted, but the village's defenses slowed them just enough to allow many to escape. Fires consumed barns and workshops, yet the spirit of the people endured. Survivors would rebuild, learning from the attack, adjusting their strategies, and fortifying their homes against the uncertainty of future raids. For the Vikings, the raid was more than just plunder. Each strike brought experience, knowledge of new lands, and stories to share with kin in their distant homelands. Every village, river, and town mapped in their minds, each raid carefully recorded in memory as they returned across the waves to Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. England, in turn, was changing under the pressure of these northern shadows. Fortifications grew stronger, communities more vigilant, and leaders more strategic. The Vikings had brought devastation, yes, but also transformation, a harsh teacher shaping the resilience and determination of the English people. And as the longships disappeared into the horizon, leaving behind smoke and whispers of their presence, both the raiders and the raided would carry the story forward. The tides of the North Sea had become a passage between worlds, connecting lands, shaping lives, and leaving marks that no fire or sword could ever entirely erase. As the Viking raids pressed on, the people of England realized that survival required more than courage. It required adaptation. Towns began to rise from the ashes with stronger walls, and villages along rivers learned to retreat to fortified enclosures when the longships appeared on the horizon. This was the beginning of what historians would later call the Age of Fortresses, a time when wood and stone became shields against the relentless tide from the north. In Wessex, King Ethelwulf worked tirelessly to strengthen his defenses. He commanded the building of watchtowers along the coast, signaling bells installed to warn of approaching raiders. Soldiers trained rigorously, learning to anticipate the strategies of the Vikings who had once seemed unstoppable. Yet the Northmen were not easily deterred. They studied the land as keenly as the English studied them, finding secret inlets, river mouths, and hidden beaches where their ships could land unnoticed. One autumn morning, as the mist clung low over the fields, a small coastal town spotted the unmistakable black sails of longships far off the horizon. Panic rippled through the villagers, yet this time they did not flee blindly. Guided by prior knowledge, they moved toward the safety of their fortifications. Edric, now a seasoned warrior and leader, took command. His presence brought order to the chaos, and the villagers found strength in his calm determination. When the Vikings arrived, they found a different world than they had encountered in years past. The village, though smaller than the great towns of Wessex, was prepared. Wooden barricades slowed the raiders' advance, and the defenders' knowledge of the terrain turned the shoreline into a trap. Axes clashed, arrows flew, and the sound of battle echoed across the estuary, but for the first time, the Northmen faced resistance that was not easily overcome. The clash was fierce, yet measured. The Vikings, though formidable, encountered a new reality. England was learning. Each encounter became a lesson. Each raid met with more strategy and planning by the English. Survivors told stories of the battle, not just of destruction, but of bravery, cunning, and moments where villagers stood firm against seemingly unstoppable odds. Meanwhile, the Vikings carried tales of these encounters back to their homelands. They spoke of villages that had adapted, of defenses that tested their skill, and of warriors who refused to surrender. The Northmen understood that their world and the world of England were beginning to mirror each other in complexity. Each raid was no longer a simple pursuit of wealth. It was a contest of wits, strength, and endurance, played out across the rivers and coastlines of a land that had become both foe and teacher. The cycle of attack and adaptation continued, shaping the people and the land. England's shores, once vulnerable and quiet, now held watchtowers, fortified towns, and communities that had learned to read the language of the sea. And in the distance, the longships waited, silhouettes against the horizon, carrying men who would forever push the limits of courage and cunning, while leaving a trail of history written in fire, timber, and the whispers of those who survived. By the mid-9th century, the Viking raids had become a relentless rhythm across England. The people had learned to read the wind and the tide as carefully as the patterns of the longships themselves. Towns along the coast were no longer defenseless. They had become centers of strategy and courage, where knowledge of the enemy and the land itself could turn the tide of any encounter. King Alfred of Wessex, known later as Alfred the Great, emerged as a beacon of leadership during these perilous times. Unlike many rulers before him, Alfred understood that England could not survive by simply hiding behind walls or fleeing from the sea. He began to organize his forces with discipline, fortifying towns and building a network of burhs, walled settlements designed to provide safe refuge for villagers and act as strongholds against invaders. Each burh was carefully positioned, close enough to rivers to allow supply, but strong enough to withstand assault, a silent message to the Northmen that the land they had once raided with impunity had learned to fight back. In one small riverside settlement, villagers prepared for yet another raid. The black sails appeared far across the water, cutting through the morning mist. Yet this time, fear was tempered with resolve. Edric, now older still and seasoned by decades of conflict, guided the townspeople to their boar. Children and elders found safety behind the walls, while warriors took positions along battlements, their eyes trained on the approaching enemy. When the Vikings landed, they found resistance unlike anything they had previously encountered. The defenders, equipped with knowledge, courage, and sharpened tactics, held their ground. Arrows rained down on the raiders, and the longships, usually a symbol of swift conquest, could not maneuver as freely in the narrow river channels. The battle was fierce, yet measured, a contest of endurance and strategy rather than pure strength. The Vikings, ever adaptable, pressed forward, but even they recognized that England had changed. They had once arrived to villages unprepared, monasteries defenseless, and towns vulnerable. Now, every settlement was a fortress, every river patrolled, and every attack met with knowledge earned from years of survival. These encounters, though violent, forged a new England, resilient, united, and ever watchful. Beyond the battles, stories traveled back to the northern lands. The Vikings spoke of towns that had resisted, of warriors who fought not just with weapons but with wisdom, and of leaders like Alfred who challenged them in ways no single raid had before. For the English, these victories, small and large, were reminders that even against a feared enemy, courage, foresight, and community could turn the tide. As the longships retreated once more into the horizon, the rivers and coasts of England breathed a collective sigh. The raids had not ended, nor would they entirely cease, but the balance had begun to shift. The Northmen were still a presence, looming and unpredictable, yet the people of England had discovered their strength, their strategy, and the enduring power of resistance. The stage was set for the final chapters of this struggle, a time when kings, warriors, and communities would face the ultimate test of endurance against the relentless force from across the sea, and the story of the Viking raids would reach its profound, lasting mark on the land and its people. The years passed, and the Viking raids, once sudden and terrifying, became part of the rhythm of life along England's coasts and rivers. The people had learned to adapt, to anticipate, and to endure. They built fortresses, trained armies, and shared stories of bravery that echoed through the generations. Villages that had been destroyed rose again, stronger, fortified, and wiser. King Alfred of Wessex emerged as a symbol of resilience. His strategy of fortified bursts, combined with a disciplined army and fleet, turned the tide against the Northmen. The Vikings, who had once seemed unstoppable, began to face a land that could resist, challenge, and even repel them. Yet even in retreat, the Northmen left an imprint on England, not only through plunder and fire, but through culture, trade, and the intermingling of peoples over time. The longships that had once appeared like shadows now carried fewer spoils and more stories. Young warriors in Norway, Denmark, and Sweden listened to tales of the battles, of towns that had fought back, and of leaders who had matched their cunning with strategy. The raids became more than acts of conquest. They became chapters in a shared history, connecting distant lands through the relentless motion of the sea. For the English, the raids became a lesson in resilience. Communities learned to rebuild quickly, to guard knowledge and wealth, and to face uncertainty with courage. Families remembered ancestors who had survived the terror of sudden attacks, and those stories passed down strengthened the bonds between people, shaping a culture that valued vigilance, unity, and foresight. Edric, the warrior who had guided villages through countless raids, eventually laid down his axe and reflected on the decades he had witnessed. He had seen fire and devastation, but he had also seen courage, strategy, and survival. The Northmen had tested the limits of every community, yet in doing so, they had unwittingly forged a stronger England, a land that had learned from adversity and had transformed its fear into preparedness. As the final raids diminished, the Northmen gradually integrated into the lands they had once sought only to plunder. Trade flourished. Where once there had been terror, settlements grew along rivers where longships had landed, and the mingling of cultures left an enduring mark. The fear of the sea remained, but it was tempered by the knowledge that humanity, in its courage and ingenuity, could endure even the fiercest storms. And so, the story of the Viking raids on England passed into history, not just as a tale of fire and conquest, but as a story of adaptation, resilience, and transformation. The waves continued to lap against the shore, carrying whispers of distant lands, while the people of England, forever changed, looked to the horizon with both caution and determination. The Northmen had arrived like shadows from the sea, but they had left behind a legacy that shaped the land, its people, and its history for centuries to come. In the winter of the year 800, Rome stood quiet beneath cold skies. Snow covered its ancient streets, and the city moved slowly, as it often did when history prepared to turn a page. Rome was no longer the center of empire it once had been, but its memory still carried power. Kings understood this, and so did the church. Charlemagne arrived in Rome late that year. He was already the most powerful ruler in Western Europe, king of the Franks and Lombards, commanding vast lands through discipline, warfare, and reform. His authority stretched from the North Sea to central Italy, yet he entered Rome not as an emperor, but as a protector. Only a year earlier, Pope Leo III had faced rebellion. Accused of serious crimes by Roman nobles, he had been attacked and forced to flee the city. With no army of his own, the Pope had turned north for help. Charlemagne received him, listened to his case, and decided in his favor. With Frankish protection, Leo was restored to his position in Rome. By the time Charlemagne returned to the city in 800, the political balance was clear. The Pope owed his safety to the Frankish king. The Roman people saw Charlemagne as a figure of order and stability, and the old idea of empire, long absent in the West, began to feel possible again. On Christmas Day, Charlemagne attended Mass at St. Peter's Basilica. He did so as a Christian ruler, not expecting ceremony or elevation. Later accounts suggested that he believed the visit to be religious rather than political. Whether this was true or carefully stated afterward remained a subject of debate. During the Mass, as Charlemagne knelt in prayer, Pope Leo III approached him. Without prior public announcement, the Pope placed a crown upon Charlemagne's head. He then declared him Emperor of the Romans, granting him a title that had not existed in Western Europe for more than 3 centuries. The congregation responded with acclamations. The ceremony connected Charlemagne to the legacy of ancient Rome, transforming him from a king into an emperor. With this act, the Pope asserted his authority to crown rulers, while Charlemagne accepted a role that reshaped Europe's political structure. The coronation created a new empire, the Holy Roman Empire, though its form differed greatly from the ancient Roman state. It was Christian, Germanic, and deeply tied to the Church. Power now rested on a partnership between throne and altar, each reinforcing the other. Charlemagne did not immediately celebrate. Contemporary sources suggested that he understood the consequences of the crown. The Eastern Roman Empire still existed in Constantinople, and its rulers did not recognize a Western emperor. The act in Rome therefore created tension as well as prestige. Nevertheless, the moment had passed. The crown had been placed, the title spoken, and history had shifted. Charlemagne had entered the basilica as a king. He left it as an emperor. After the coronation, Charlemagne remained in Rome for several weeks. The celebrations were restrained, shaped more by solemn acknowledgement than open triumph. The new title carried honor, but it also carried responsibility, and Charlemagne understood that an emperor's authority extended beyond borders and battles. The Pope had gained a powerful ally, but the alliance was not without tension. By crowning Charlemagne, Leo III had sent a clear message. Imperial authority in the West now required the blessing of the Church. This act strengthened the papacy, yet it also bound it to the fate of a ruler whose power rested on armies, laws, and land. Charlemagne returned north early in the following year. As he traveled back across the Alps, messengers carried news of the coronation throughout Europe. To many, the title of emperor felt natural. Charlemagne already ruled like one. To others, it felt sudden, even dangerous. Kings and nobles now had to decide what this new empire meant for them. In Constantinople, the reaction was colder. The Eastern Roman Empire had never considered itself fallen. Its rulers viewed themselves as the true heirs of Rome, guardians of imperial tradition uninterrupted since antiquity. To them, Charlemagne's coronation was not a revival, but an intrusion. A Frankish king wearing the Roman crown challenged centuries of legitimacy. For years, the Eastern court refused to recognize Charlemagne as emperor. Diplomacy moved slowly, weighed down by pride and suspicion. Eventually, compromise emerged. In 812, the Byzantine emperor acknowledged Charlemagne as emperor, though not as emperor of the Romans. Words mattered. Titles defined power. Within his own empire, Charlemagne focused on order rather than ceremony. He did not rule from a single capital. Instead, he traveled constantly, holding assemblies, hearing disputes, and issuing laws. His authority rested on presence as much as proclamation. The empire itself was vast and uneven. It contained Franks, Saxons, Lombards, and many others, each with different customs and loyalties. Charlemagne allowed local traditions to survive, but he demanded obedience. Counts governed regions in his name. Missi Dominici, royal envoys, traveled the land to inspect officials and enforce justice. Religion remained central to imperial unity. Charlemagne believed that a Christian empire required educated clergy. He supported schools, monasteries, and scriptoria where texts were copied and preserved. This period later became known as the Carolingian Renaissance, a revival of learning that stabilized administration and faith alike. Yet peace was never complete. Along the empire's borders, enemies tested its strength. In the north and east, pagan tribes resisted conversion and rule. Campaigns were fought not only for territory but for belief. Charlemagne's wars were long and often brutal, especially against the Saxons, whose forced conversions left lasting scars. Still, Within the empire's heartlands, stability grew, roads improved, trade revived, law gained structure. For many, life under Charlemagne brought predictability unknown for generations. The crown placed on his head in Rome had changed his title, but it had not changed his nature. He ruled as he always had, with discipline, faith, and an unshakable sense of duty. The empire now existed not just in name, but in practice, and it would soon face the question every great creation must answer. Could it survive beyond its creator? As the years passed, Charlemagne's empire settled into a rhythm shaped by law, faith, and constant movement. He ruled not from a distant throne, but from the road, traveling between palaces and assemblies, ensuring that his authority was seen as well as heard. His presence reminded nobles and bishops alike that imperial power was personal, not abstract. At the heart of this rule lay a belief in order. Charlemagne issued capitularies, written laws that addressed both secular and religious life. These laws regulated everything from military service and land ownership to moral conduct and church discipline. By putting commands into writing, he strengthened unity across regions that had once followed only local custom. The church remained his closest partner. Bishops and abbots served not only as spiritual leaders, but as administrators. In return for land and protection, they offered loyalty and structure. Monasteries became centers of learning, prayer, and record-keeping. Ancient texts were copied carefully, preserving knowledge that might otherwise have vanished. This revival of learning reshaped the empire. Clergy were trained to read and write Latin properly. Schools were established at monasteries and courts. Even Charlemagne himself, though never fully literate, valued education deeply and encouraged learning among his children and officials. Yet faith was not always spread gently. Beyond the empire's borders, and even within them, resistance remained. The Saxon wars continued for decades. Rebellions flared, were crushed, and flared again. Conversion was often enforced through law and punishment. Baptism followed defeat, and churches replaced sacred groves. Charlemagne believed unity required shared belief. To him, a divided faith meant a divided empire. By the early 9th century, age began to slow him. His hair grayed, his step softened, but his authority remained firm. He relied increasingly on trusted advisors and family members. His sons were given responsibilities, trained to rule in his absence. Still, succession remained uncertain. Charlemagne had intended to divide his empire among his heirs, following Frankish tradition. Fate intervened. One by one, his sons died before him. By the final years of his life, only one legitimate son remained, Louis, later called the Pious. In 813, Charlemagne summoned an assembly at Aachen. There, without the presence of the Pope, he crowned Louis as co-emperor. This act was deliberate. It showed that imperial authority could pass without papal intervention, balancing the power once claimed by Rome. A year later, in January 814, Charlemagne died. He was buried at Aachen, in the heart of the empire he had shaped. His death marked the end of an era defined by personal rule and expansion. What remained was an enormous realm held together by law, faith, and memory. Louis inherited the crown, but not his father's strength. Internal divisions soon emerged. The unity Charlemagne had enforced began to loosen, tested by ambition and inheritance disputes. Yet the idea of empire endured. The coronation of Charlemagne had created more than a title. It had revived the concept of a Christian emperor in the West, a ruler chosen by God and crowned by the Church. This idea would shape Europe for centuries, influencing kings, popes, and conflicts yet to come. Long after borders shifted and dynasties faded, the memory of that winter day in Rome remained, a crown placed in silence, a title spoken aloud, and a world quietly transformed. After Charlemagne's death, the empire passed fully into the hands of his son, Louis the Pious. The crown, heavy with expectation, rested uneasily upon him. Where Charlemagne had ruled through strength and command, Louis ruled through devotion and conscience. He was deeply religious, sincere in his faith, and determined to govern as a Christian emperor rather than a warrior king. This difference soon became visible. Louis sought to reform the court, removing corruption and enforcing moral discipline. Nobles who had thrived under Charlemagne's practical rule now found themselves judged by stricter standards. While his intentions were sincere, his authority lacked the firmness his father had embodied so naturally. The greatest challenge came not from outside enemies, but from within his own family. Louis followed Frankish custom and divided the empire among his sons while still alive. This decision fractured unity. Each division weakened the idea of a single empire and encouraged rivalry. Sons rebelled against their father, then against each other. Alliances shifted. Loyalty became uncertain. Civil war followed. The empire Charlemagne had forged through decades of effort began to strain under the weight of divided rule. Armies that once expanded borders now fought one another. Authority fractured, and the emperor's voice no longer carried unquestioned command. Yet even amid chaos, the imperial title endured. When Louis died in 840, his sons continued their struggle until the Treaty of Verdun in 843 formally divided the empire into 3 parts. These divisions would later become the foundations of modern Europe, lands that evolved into France, Germany, and Italy. Though the empire was broken politically, the idea born in Rome survived intact. Future rulers continued to seek the imperial crown. German kings traveled south to be crowned by popes, repeating the act that Charlemagne had once undergone. The Holy Roman Empire endured for centuries, shifting in power and form, but always drawing legitimacy from that first coronation. The relationship between emperor and pope remained complex and often tense. Each claimed authority from God. Each needed the other. This tension shaped medieval Europe, influencing wars, reforms, and religious movements. Charlemagne himself became a symbol. He was remembered as the father of Europe, a ruler who restored order after centuries of fragmentation. His coronation marked a turning point, not because it recreated ancient Rome, but because it redefined leadership for a new age, Christian, feudal, and deeply intertwined with faith. In monasteries and courts, his name was spoken with reverence. Chroniclers wrote of his justice, his strength, and his devotion. Over time, legend blended with fact, and Charlemagne grew larger than life. Yet at the center of it all remained a single moment, a king kneeling in prayer, a crown placed without warning, an empire declared into existence. The world that followed was imperfect and divided, but it was shaped by that act. The coronation of Charlemagne did not end history's struggles. It redirected them, and its echoes continued long after the snow of that Roman winter had melted away. As generations passed, the coronation of Charlemagne slowly moved from living memory into recorded history. Those who had stood in St. Peter's Basilica were gone, but the meaning of that winter morning endured through words, rituals, and imitation. Kings no longer asked whether an emperor could exist in the West. They asked how they might become one. The imperial crown became an object of longing. Rulers across Europe studied Charlemagne's reign, not merely for guidance, but for legitimacy. To rule as a king was no longer enough. The title of emperor promised something greater, a claim to divine order, to unity, to Rome itself. Even when the empire fractured politically, its symbolic power remained whole. German kings in particular inherited this ambition. They ruled strong territories north of the Alps and looked south toward Italy and Rome. There, in the city of apostles and ruins, the ancient ritual waited. To be crowned emperor still required papal blessing, and so the journey to Rome became both a political risk and a sacred pilgrimage. Not all journeys ended in peace. Some emperors clashed with popes, arguing over who truly held authority. Others were crowned only to find their power challenged at home. Yet the ritual endured. Each coronation echoed Charlemagne's, drawing authority from his precedent. The church, too, guarded this legacy carefully. By crowning Charlemagne, the papacy had elevated itself as the gatekeeper of empire. This power allowed popes to shape kingship, reward loyalty, and resist domination. At times, emperors attempted to control the church in return. At other times, popes humbled emperors, reminding them that crowns could be given and taken by divine will. This struggle defined much of medieval Europe. Wars were fought not only for land, but for legitimacy. Documents were written tracing authority back to Charlemagne. His name appeared in charters, sermons, and legal arguments. To invoke him was to claim continuity with the sacred past. Meanwhile, scholars continued the work begun under his reign. Monasteries preserved texts copied during the Carolingian Renaissance. Latin survived as the language of learning and administration. Law codes and chronicles created a shared memory across fragmented lands. Even when borders changed, ideas remained connected. Charlemagne himself became more than a historical figure. Stories portrayed him as a just ruler, a defender of the church, and a model of Christian kingship. In time, legend softened the harsher truths of his reign. The violence of conquest faded, while order and faith were emphasized. History shaped him into what later generations needed him to be. Yet behind the legend stood reality. A single coronation had reshaped Europe's political imagination. It had linked power to ritual, authority to faith, and rule to history. It taught rulers that legitimacy could be inherited not only through blood, but through symbols. The crown placed upon Charlemagne's head had long since disappeared. Empires rose and fell, cities changed, languages evolved, but the idea born that day remained, quiet, persistent, and powerful, an idea that would continue to influence rulers long after the man himself had passed into memory. By the later centuries of the Middle Ages, the empire created by Charlemagne existed more as an idea than a unified state. Its borders shifted constantly, and its authority depended largely on the strength of the ruler who wore the crown. Yet the title of emperor still carried echoes of Rome, faith, and destiny. There was no single capital. Unlike ancient emperors, those who followed Charlemagne ruled from many cities. Power moved between courts, assemblies, and bishoprics. The empire became a network rather than a center, held together by oaths, tradition, and ritual. Still, every emperor traced his legitimacy back to that Christmas day in Rome. Coronations continued to follow a familiar path. A king would secure power at home, then seek recognition from the Pope. The journey south remained dangerous, filled with political risk and military uncertainty. To reach Rome was to expose one's authority to challenge, yet without the crown, the imperial title remained incomplete. The relationship between empire and church remained uneasy. Popes feared domination, emperors feared dependence. At times, the balance held. At others, it collapsed into open conflict. Excommunications, rival claimants, and public humiliation became tools in this struggle. Yet neither side could fully abandon the other without undermining its own authority. The memory of Charlemagne hovered over these conflicts like a distant standard. He was remembered as a ruler who balanced faith and force, church and crown. Later emperors measured themselves against him, often unfavorably. Few matched his reach, fewer still matched his unity. Meanwhile, Europe itself changed. Cities grew, trade expanded, new powers emerged beyond the empire's traditional borders. Kings of France and England strengthened their states, no longer seeking imperial titles. Authority became increasingly local, tied to law, land, and language. Even so, the imperial ideal endured. When rulers spoke of order, unity, or Christian kingship, they echoed Charlemagne's model. When disputes arose over legitimacy, his coronation remained the reference point. The empire no longer ruled all of Western Europe, but it shaped how Europe understood rule itself. Centuries later, the Holy Roman Empire would finally dissolve. In 1806, under pressure from new political realities, the title was abandoned. Yet its end did not erase its beginning. The coronation of Charlemagne remained intact in memory and record. It stood as a moment when the past was claimed, reshaped, and carried forward. It showed how symbols could outlive armies and how ideas could govern long after power faded. The empire had changed many times, but its foundation remained the same: a crown, a blessing, and a belief in ordered rule. Historians continue to return to the coronation of Charlemagne, not because of its ceremony alone, but because of what it revealed about power and belief. The event was simple in action, yet vast in consequence. A crown placed by a pope altered the course of Western political thought. The act joined two legacies. From Rome came the memory of empire, law, and universal rule. From Christianity came the belief that authority was granted by God. Charlemagne's coronation fused these traditions into a new form, one suited to the medieval world. This fusion reshaped kingship. Rulers were no longer judged only by conquest or inheritance. They were expected to defend the church, uphold moral order, and rule in harmony with divine law. Even when they failed, the expectation remained. Power was no longer purely earthly. Charlemagne's role in this transformation was decisive. He did not invent the idea of Christian rulership, but his coronation gave it visible form. His empire became a model others sought to imitate, even when they lacked the strength to sustain it. The title of emperor became both an aspiration and a burden. The coronation also altered the church's position. By claiming the right to crown emperors, the papacy asserted spiritual authority over temporal power. This claim would be challenged repeatedly, but it could never be ignored. The balance between altar and throne became one of Europe's defining struggles. Yet the coronation was not planned in every detail. Whether Charlemagne anticipated the crown remains uncertain. What is clear is that once placed, it could not be removed without consequence. The moment bound ruler and church together in a way neither could fully control. Over time, the story gained symbolic clarity. Charlemagne was remembered kneeling humbly, receiving authority not through ambition, but through divine will. This image shaped how later generations understood the event, even if reality had been more complex. The truth lay somewhere between chance and intention. The Pope needed protection, Charlemagne needed legitimacy, Rome needed order. From these needs emerged an act that satisfied all three, at least for a time. The world that followed was imperfect, divided, and often violent. Yet it was a world shaped by shared ideas, law, faith, and memory. The coronation of Charlemagne stood at the beginning of that shared structure. It marked the moment when Europe turned from fragments toward a vision of unity, even if that vision remained incomplete. And in the quiet retelling of history, the moment still spoke. A king became an emperor, a city remembered its past, and an idea began its long journey through time. By the time centuries had passed, the coronation of Charlemagne no longer belonged only to history. It had become a reference point, a quiet beginning that scholars, rulers, and chroniclers continue to revisit. The event endured not because it created a perfect empire, but because it reshaped how power was understood in the West. Charlemagne's empire did not last in its original form. It fragmented, shifted, and weakened under the pressure of inheritance and time. Yet the idea of empire, Christian, ordered, and sanctioned by the Church, remained firmly rooted. Future rulers did not attempt to recreate Rome exactly as it had been. Instead, they pursued the legacy Charlemagne had established. This legacy was built on continuity rather than permanence. The coronation linked ancient Rome to medieval Europe, creating a bridge between worlds that might otherwise have remained separate. It gave medieval rulers a past to inherit and a future to claim. Authority no longer emerged only from strength or ancestry, but from history itself. For the Church, the coronation confirmed its central role in political life. By placing the crown, the papacy shaped the structure of Western leadership. Even when emperors challenged this authority, they did so within a framework the Church had helped define. The struggle between spiritual and temporal power became a defining feature of European history. Charlemagne's image continued to evolve. He was remembered as a lawgiver, a defender of faith, and a restorer of order. Over time, legend simplified him, turning a complex ruler into a symbol of unity and justice. Yet beneath the legend remained a historical truth. His coronation changed the direction of European governance. The moment itself remained remarkably quiet in description. There was no battle, no proclamation of conquest. There was only a ritual performed within a church, witnessed by clergy and people who could not have known its full consequences. The power of the act lay not in force, but in recognition. That recognition shaped centuries. From medieval emperors to modern historians, the coronation of Charlemagne stood as a reminder that history often turns on symbols as much as on events. A crown placed at the right moment could carry more weight than an army. Even after the Holy Roman Empire ended, the memory remained intact. It lived on in political thought, in discussions of legitimacy, and in Europe's understanding of itself as a civilization shaped by shared heritage. Charlemagne did not live to see the full consequences of his elevation. He ruled, he reformed, and he died, leaving behind an empire already beginning to change. But the act that crowned him endured beyond his lifetime. The snow of that Roman winter melted long ago. The basilica remained. The crown passed into history. Yet the echo of that moment continued, soft, persistent, and enduring, marking the day when a king knelt, a pope crowned, and Europe quietly stepped into a new age. The war began quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the hearts of kings and the halls of courts, but its shadow would stretch across a century. England and France, two mighty kingdoms of medieval Europe, had long been bound by tangled claims, old loyalties, and whispered grievances. By the year 1337, the simmering tensions erupted into a conflict that would endure for generations, known to history as the 100 Years' War. It was not a single battle, but a tapestry of struggles, sieges, and moments of triumph and despair, each shaping the fate of nations. It all began with the claim of Edward III of England to the French throne. The French crown, faced with the death of Charles IV without a direct male heir, turned to the rule of succession through the Salic law, denying Edward's claim. But Edward, a proud and ambitious king, refused to bow to this decision. His claim was more than a matter of inheritance. It was a spark for a larger war, a challenge that would test the courage of armies and the resilience of kingdoms. The early years were marked by careful maneuvering and strategic patience. Edward did not rush to battle immediately, but sought alliances, strengthening his position through treaties and marriages that would bring him support in Gascony and Flanders. The tension between the two kingdoms was palpable, a constant hum in the background of European politics. It was as if the entire continent was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable clash. Then, in 1340, the first sparks of combat ignited on a broader scale. The English fleet clashed with the French at sea near Sluys, in what would become a decisive naval victory for Edward. The battle opened the channel to English dominance, and with it, the possibility of sending armies to French soil with far greater security. The English longbowmen, with their deadly accuracy, began to make their mark on the world of warfare, signaling a shift in how battles could be won. Yet the war was not simply a series of battles. It was a series of human stories. Nobles rode with banners held high, knights prepared for glory, and peasants were drawn into campaigns that uprooted villages and burned fields. Every siege was a test of endurance, every ambush a sudden sting of fear. The English victories, like the famed triumph at Crécy in 1346, would become legendary, demonstrating both strategy and the cruel unpredictability of war. But even as the English marched and fought, France did not crumble. Its people endured, its leaders adapted, and the struggle stretched on, year after year, battle after battle. And so, the 100 Years' War had begun, not as a single, grand battle, but as a slow, consuming storm. The first sparks of conflict had been struck, yet the horizon was dark with the promise of countless struggles to come. Kingdoms braced themselves for what would be a century of warfare, a century of changing fortunes, and a century that would leave marks upon the land and the people that no storyteller could easily forget. As the years wore on, the war stretched into the 1350s, and the weight of its battles began to shape the destinies of both kingdoms. France, though bruised by early English victories, was far from defeated. The French army had been caught unprepared at Crécy, yet they learned, adapted, and prepared for the campaigns yet to come. The people, though weary, clung to their towns and fortresses, rebuilding walls and fortifying castles, knowing that the English longbowmen could strike anywhere with relentless precision. The English, emboldened by their triumphs, pressed deeper into French lands. Edward III's son, Edward, the Black Prince, became a figure of growing renown. With a mix of cunning strategy and fierce leadership, he led his forces through southwestern France, leaving a trail of captured towns and humbled lords. The Battle of Poitiers in 1356 would become a testament to both his tactical genius and the evolving face of warfare. It was there that the French king, John II, was captured, thrown into the uncertainty of English imprisonment. The shock reverberated through France like a dark thunderclap, sending nobles scrambling to maintain order and morale in a kingdom suddenly bereft of its king. Amid the clash of armies, the landscape itself bore witness to the toll of war. Fields once vibrant with crops were turned to churned mud beneath the march of soldiers and horses. Villages burned, leaving only the stone skeletons of homes and churches. Refugees fled along narrow roads, carrying what little they could salvage, their faces etched with fear and exhaustion. For ordinary people, the 100 Years' War was not a distant tale of kings and knights. It was hunger. It was fire. It was the unending hum of dread that traveled from village to village. Yet even in this chaos, moments of strategy and diplomacy were quietly shaping the future. Treaties were signed and broken, ransoms negotiated, and alliances formed in shadows as much as in courts. Edward III returned to England briefly to secure funds and reinforcements, leaving the Black Prince to carry the weight of campaigns in France. The war was no longer just about land. It was about prestige, honor, and the fragile threads of political power that could unravel with a single defeat. In towns across France, rumors of English atrocities spread, fueling resentment and a growing desire for revenge. Leaders like Charles of Navarre and local barons balanced loyalties carefully, navigating the treacherous waters between the French crown and English invaders. The war was as much about the minds and hearts of people as it was about armies on the field. And through it all, the longbowmen remained a silent, deadly force, their arrows flying like the shadows of fate over every battlefield they touched. By the time the 1360s arrived, the 100 Years' War had evolved into something larger than a single campaign. It had become a long, drawn-out struggle that shaped lives, determined fates, and tested the endurance of kingdoms. Every victory carried a cost. Every defeat left scars that would take decades to heal. And both England and France learned, slowly, that this war would not end quickly. It was a storm that had begun with a claim to a throne, yet it had grown into a conflict that would echo across generations, leaving behind stories of valor, suffering, and the relentless march of history itself. As the war trudged on into the later decades of the 14th century, France found itself haunted not only by the English army, but by internal turmoil. The death of King John II in English captivity left the French throne to his son, Charles V, a king of quiet intelligence and strategic patience. Unlike his predecessors, Charles understood that victory did not always belong to those who struck first. Sometimes it belonged to those who waited, rebuilt, and struck with precision. Under his guidance, the French began to recover their strength, carefully fortifying towns, training soldiers, and reclaiming territory lost to the English years before. Meanwhile, England, weary from the endless cost of campaigns abroad, struggled to maintain its hold on French lands. Edward III, aged and burdened by the ceaseless demands of war, faced political pressures at home. The Black Prince, though celebrated for his victories and military brilliance, was beginning to feel the weight of illness and the toll of constant battle. Yet even as fatigue settled over the English leadership, their early successes continued to cast a long shadow across France. Regions that had once resisted now bore the mark of English rule, at least in name, with castles garrisoned and taxes collected to support further campaigns. It was during these years that a new form of warfare began to emerge. Siege engines, longbows, and careful maneuvering replaced the brutal cavalry charges that had dominated earlier battles. French commanders, learning from past mistakes, began to avoid open confrontation with the English when possible, instead relying on guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and the attrition of enemy forces. Villages that resisted could count on swift reprisals, while those that surrendered were spared further destruction, a delicate balance that often determined whether a town would survive or be reduced to ashes. Yet the human cost of the war was inescapable. Peasants, who had once tilled the fields and tended to livestock, found themselves conscripted into labor for fortifications or swept into armies against their will. Entire families were displaced, wandering roads that had become as dangerous as any battlefield. Disease and famine, compounded by the disruption of agriculture, claimed lives as surely as any sword. In towns and villages, the constant toll of grief became a rhythm of daily life, a silent witness to the unending conflict. Amid this backdrop, the English sought new opportunities to assert dominance. The young Richard II, crowned after the death of Edward III, inherited a kingdom both proud of past victories and burdened by the immense costs of sustaining them. England's focus remained divided between the lure of conquest and the necessity of governance, while in France, Charles V's patient strategies began to yield results. Territories once under English control slipped away, reclaimed by local lords who now pledged loyalty to the French crown. By the mid-1370s, it became clear that the war was no longer a swift series of battles, but a long chess game between two kingdoms, each testing the limits of endurance, wealth, and courage. Both sides learned to adapt, to strike when opportunity allowed, and to endure when circumstances demanded. The 100 Years' War had become less a war of kings and more a war of generations, leaving in its wake a land and a people forever changed, scarred by conflict, yet unbroken in spirit. By the 1380s, the war had settled into a grim rhythm of raids, sieges, and carefully plotted campaigns. The quiet, methodical strategy of Charles V had begun to bear fruit. He avoided large-scale pitched battles, understanding the devastating strength of the English longbow and the pride of the Black Prince's tactics. Instead, the French focused on reclaiming territory, piece by piece, fortifying towns and cutting supply lines. Small victories accumulated over time, slowly shifting the balance in favor of France. In the English camps, frustration grew. The victories of earlier decades, Crécy, Poitiers, had won fame and glory, but they had not secured lasting dominion. Edward III was long gone, and Richard II's reign was increasingly distracted by domestic unrest, political intrigue, and the challenges of financing campaigns abroad. England had learned that conquering territory in France was one thing, but holding it against a clever, patient opponent was another entirely. The war demanded more than bravery. It demanded resources, loyalty, and the unyielding will to endure a century of conflict. Amid these political and military maneuvers, the lives of ordinary people continued to be marked by hardship. Towns under English occupation experienced both oppression and negotiation. Villagers were forced to pay taxes, provide food, and sometimes join militias, while French partisans staged ambushes and sabotaged enemy supply lines. The countryside became a living battleground, and the borderlands between England's holdings and French loyal territories were filled with fear and uncertainty. Yet even in this chaos, moments of legend emerged. French commanders, once cautious, began to employ clever strategies to draw English forces into disadvantageous positions. At sea, the French fleet harried English supply lines, while on land, fortifications were strengthened to resist the formidable assaults of the English army. For the first time in decades, France could hope not just to survive, but to reclaim what had been lost. The human stories of the war were as vivid as the strategies themselves. Knights and soldiers fought with loyalty to their lords, often at the cost of their lives. Peasants hid from marauding forces or joined local militias to protect their homes. The rhythm of daily life had adapted to the presence of conflict. Harvests were timed to avoid armies, and local economies revolved around the constant demands of war. Letters and rumors carried tales of courage and despair across villages and castles, binding communities together, even in fear. By the end of the 1380s, the 100 Years' War had settled into a long, grinding conflict. Victory and defeat were measured not only in battles won, but in territories reclaimed, towns fortified, and populations preserved. The war had grown beyond a mere dispute over the French throne. It was a struggle that defined the era, shaping the politics, culture, and hearts of both nations. It was a war of patience, strategy, and human endurance, a war that would continue to echo across generations, leaving France and England forever marked by its relentless span. The dawn of the 15th century brought a new intensity to the 100 Years' War. Generations had grown up knowing little else, but the shadow of conflict and the struggle between England and France had become as much about identity as about crowns. By now, the French monarchy had learned from years of defeat, and under capable leadership, they began to reclaim not only lands, but also pride. The English, meanwhile, weary from decades of campaigning and internal strife, sought to maintain their hold on territories while searching for opportunities to assert their fading dominance. In 1415, the war reached a dramatic turning point at Agincourt. Henry V of England, a young and determined king, marched his army across northern France. Fatigued by long campaigns and under pressure from a stubborn French resistance, he faced a larger French army, confident and prepared. Yet on that fateful October day, the muddy fields of northern France became the stage for one of the most legendary battles of the war. The English longbowmen, placed strategically along narrow terrain, unleashed a storm of arrows that cut down the French knights even before they could reach the English lines. What might have been a simple engagement became a catastrophic defeat for the French, with countless nobles falling under the rain of arrows, their dreams of victory extinguished in a single day. Agincourt was more than a military victory. It was a moment that would echo across centuries. Henry V had demonstrated that discipline, strategy, and clever use of terrain could overcome sheer numbers. Yet, for all its glory, the battle also carried the weight of tragedy. The fields were littered with bodies, the cries of the wounded mingling with the chants of triumph, and the victory came at a cost to both sides. For the French, it was a humiliation; for the English, a fleeting taste of dominance that could not last indefinitely in a war of such magnitude. In the years that followed, France did not surrender. The war continued, alternating between sieges, skirmishes, and periods of uneasy truces. But, amidst the struggle, new heroes emerged. One of the most remarkable was a young woman named Joan of Arc. Born in a small village, she would rise from obscurity, claiming to hear divine guidance, to lead French forces against the English and their allies. Her presence brought a surge of hope to a beleaguered nation, inspiring soldiers and civilians alike. Though her journey would be fraught with peril, her courage marked a turning point in the war, demonstrating that resolve and faith could rival swords and armies. Meanwhile, the landscape of France continued to bear the scars of centuries of conflict. Castles and towns had been repeatedly besieged and rebuilt, fields left fallow or destroyed, and communities uprooted again and again. Life was a careful balance of survival and resilience, with ordinary people navigating the constant tension between fear and hope. The 100 Years' War had become more than a battle for a throne. It was a trial of endurance, shaping the people as much as it shaped kingdoms. By the close of the first decade of the 1400s, it was clear that the war would not be decided quickly. Agincourt had been a moment of brilliance for England, but the spirit of France, ignited by Joan and fortified by years of patient strategy, promised that the centuries-old struggle was far from over. The war, relentless and unyielding, pressed forward, a living story of human courage, folly, and the enduring pursuit of destiny. As the 1420s unfolded, France seemed to teeter on the brink of collapse. English forces, bolstered by the Treaty of Troyes, claimed much of northern France, and the French Dauphin, later Charles VII, appeared powerless to stop them. Yet amid the despair, a spark of hope arose from the most unexpected of places. Joan of Arc, a simple peasant girl from Domremy, claimed to hear the voices of saints guiding her to save France. Though many dismissed her at first, her courage and conviction quickly inspired those around her. She persuaded Charles VII to allow her to lead an army to lift the siege of Orléans, a pivotal stronghold that had long been under threat from English forces. In 1429, Joan arrived at Orléans with determination burning in her eyes and banners flying high. The English, confident in their superiority, had underestimated the power of resolve and faith. Joan's presence revitalized the French troops, who had endured years of exhaustion, fear, and defeat. With her guidance, the army mounted a series of bold attacks, surprising the English at every turn. Her leadership was not merely symbolic. She rode at the front, rallying soldiers, coordinating assaults, and maintaining morale. Slowly but surely, the siege began to crumble, and Orléans was lifted from English control. This victory at Orléans marked a turning point in the 100 Years' War. The momentum shifted as towns and fortresses across France began to resist English domination more boldly. Joan continued to inspire campaigns, pressing French forces toward Reims, where Charles VII would be crowned king. The symbolic importance of Reims the traditional site of French coronations, could not be overstated. Joan's guidance ensured that the Dauphin's legitimacy as king was publicly recognized, strengthening the morale and unity of a kingdom that had long been fractured by war. Even as Joan's influence grew, the war remained harsh and unrelenting. Battles continued, sieges dragged on, and both sides suffered from hunger, disease, and exhaustion. The countryside, already scarred by decades of conflict, bore witness to repeated destruction. Villagers rebuilt homes only to see them razed again, and entire communities learned to endure the constant rhythm of fear and survival. Yet amid this chaos, the story of Joan of Arc offered hope, a reminder that even in the darkest times, courage and conviction could change the course of history. Her capture in 1430, betrayal by Burgundian allies, and subsequent trial cast a shadow over the French cause, yet her martyrdom only strengthened the resolve of the French people. The legend of Joan inspired armies and civilians alike, fueling the resurgence of French power that had been dormant for decades. The 100 Years' War, though far from over, now carried a new spirit of determination, a belief that English dominance could be challenged and reversed. By the mid-1430s, the tide had begun to turn. The English still controlled significant territory, but France, once fractured and demoralized, was reclaiming strength. The war had evolved from a series of battles for claims to the throne into a struggle for national identity, resilience, and pride. The sacrifices of ordinary people, the strategy of kings, and the courage of remarkable individuals like Joan of Arc were shaping the future of France, preparing the stage for the final chapters of a war that had spanned generations. By the 1440s, France had regained much of its strength, and the tide of the 100 Years' War was steadily turning against England. The memory of Joan of Arc's courage still resonated throughout the land, inspiring soldiers and peasants alike. Though she was gone, her spirit had awakened a sense of unity and purpose in the French kingdom that could not be easily extinguished. Charles VII, now fully established as king, capitalized on this newfound morale, reorganizing the army, training professional soldiers, and reinforcing fortifications across the country. The English, weakened by internal strife and the immense cost of decades of war, struggled to maintain their distant territories. Supply lines were stretched thin, rebellion simmered among the French population, and the once mighty English army began to feel the weariness of prolonged conflict. Where once English forces had moved with confidence, they now faced a cautious, determined enemy ready to exploit every mistake. France, learning from the mistakes of the past, focused on recapturing towns and castles one by one, rather than risking open battles that could result in massive losses. In 1450, at the Battle of Formigny, this strategy proved decisive. French forces, employing artillery alongside traditional infantry, struck at an English army attempting to hold Normandy. The clash ended in a crushing victory for France, demonstrating the growing importance of gunpowder in warfare. The English, unprepared for these changes in military tactics, suffered devastating losses, and Normandy soon fell into French hands. The momentum that had been building since Orléans now surged forward, signaling that the end of English dominance in France was near. The final years of the 100 Years' War were marked by the gradual expulsion of English forces from French soil. Coastal towns, once held as strategic footholds by the English, were recaptured through careful planning, sieges, and negotiations. The war that had once seemed endless was drawing to a close, but its impact on the land and its people was profound. Villages rebuilt, fields returned to cultivation, and families began the slow process of recovery, though the scars of decades of war were everywhere visible. Throughout the war, the nature of combat and society had changed. Nobility, once the dominant force in battles, had to adapt to the rise of professional armies, longbows, and artillery. Ordinary soldiers, often conscripted from towns and villages, became essential to the success of campaigns. Entire communities bore the consequences of strategies devised in distant castles, and the people of France, having endured famine, disease, and destruction, had shown a resilience that would shape their identity for generations. By 1453, after nearly 116 years of intermittent conflict, the Hundred Years' War came to an end. The French had successfully reclaimed almost all of their territory, leaving only the port city of Calais under English control. What began as a dispute over succession had transformed into a defining struggle for national identity, power, and survival. Both nations emerged changed, England bruised and reflective, France scarred but unified. The 100 Years' War left behind a tapestry of stories, both heroic and tragic. It had been a war of kings and peasants, of strategy and endurance, of hope and despair. Across generations, it had shaped the course of history, leaving a mark that would never be forgotten, echoing in the lives of all who had endured its trials and survived to tell its story. As the war drew to a close in 1453, the fields and towns of France were silent witnesses to the end of a conflict that had stretched across generations. Decades of battles, sieges, and political maneuvering had finally yielded a France that was largely united and free of English domination. The port of Calais remained the only English stronghold, a last reminder of foreign ambitions, but the vast majority of the country had been reclaimed. For the people who had endured hunger, fire, and the constant march of armies, the end of the war brought a fragile relief, a chance to rebuild lives long disrupted. The conclusion of the 100 Years' War was not marked by a single grand battle, but by a gradual collapse of English power in France. French kings, learning from centuries of conflict, had reorganized their armies and administration, creating a sense of unity that had been lacking in earlier years. The nobility, once fractured and often self-interested, began to align with the crown, understanding that the strength of the kingdom depended on cooperation. Villages rebuilt walls, towns restored markets, and commerce slowly returned, weaving a delicate thread of stability over a land that had been torn apart for more than a century. Yet even as peace settled, the legacy of the war endured. Countless lives had been lost, families had been displaced, and generations had grown up knowing nothing but the shadow of conflict. Monuments and churches bore scars from sieges, and the countryside was dotted with reminders of the battles that had raged across its plains. Stories of courage, strategy, and human endurance passed from village to village, ensuring that the memory of the war would not fade. Heroes like the Black Prince, Henry V, and Joan of Arc became legends, their names carried in song, story, and memory long after the swords were sheathed. The war had also transformed the nature of warfare itself. The dominance of knights on horseback began to wane, giving way to professional armies, skilled infantry, and the increasing use of artillery. The longbow, which had brought victory to Agincourt and Crécy, demonstrated the power of disciplined training and strategic placement. Lessons learned in those centuries of conflict would shape the way wars were fought for generations to come, changing the face of Europe forever. Ultimately, the 100 Years' War was more than a contest for a throne. It was a war of endurance, identity, and transformation. It tested kings and peasants alike, reshaping borders, politics, and society. It was a story of human courage and folly, of strategy and chance, of moments of triumph and despair that echoed across the generations. And as France and England moved forward, each nation carried the memory of that long century, its victories and defeats, its heroes and martyrs, its endless struggle for power and survival. The 100 Years' War had ended, but its lessons and its stories would endure, whispered across fields and castles, remembered by every soul who had lived through the shadow of its relentless, century-long storm.